Artistic revolution. Under the influence of drugs, a raging protest against the insanity of the war, releasing the unconscious mind. The 19th century had seen artists break away from the state-sanctioned art of the salon to find their own idiom through independent exhibitions. The Exposition Courbet, the Salon des Refusés, the Impressionist exhibitions, the Salon des Indépendants, and after 1903, the Salon d'Automne. All of this had created a new market, supported by a new breed of independent dealers and collectors who left artists free to explore the most avant-garde solutions to the crisis of form. For just as the official salon was no longer an appropriate vehicle to express the majority political sentiments of its own time, the appropriated forms of classicism made to serve an outdated political system were no longer able to capture modernity. And so the struggle for a new artistic vocabulary focused primarily on the city at the heart of this political and artistic struggle, Paris. Impressionists such as Renoir, Monet and Sisley had used the river Seine for their en plein air sketch-like impressions of the natural and suburban worlds. The post-impressionist Seurat continued in this tradition, and likewise André Derain and Maurice Flamingh focused on the river in the suburb of Chatou where they lived, meeting Matisse on the bridge of Chatou. Derain and Matisse became the core members of the Fauvist school, working together in Collioure, a French Mediterranean harbour close to the Spanish border, where Signac had previously painted. There, in 1905, Matisse and Derain created works which liberated colour from figurative representation, and their works were displayed at the 1905 Salon d'Automne, where the name of the school was coined in a review by Louis Vaucel entitled Donatello Amongst the Wild Ones, or Donatello chez les Fauves. Ultimately, the school was short-lived, as, having achieved their aims, other schools became the avant-garde. In 1900, Pablo Picasso arrived in Paris to see a painting of his entitled Last Moments at the Spanish pavilion of the Exposition Universelle, depicting a priest at the bedside of a dying woman. Picasso stayed in the studio of Isidre Nonel in Montmartre, an area of Paris becoming increasingly synonymous with artistic bohemianism. Throughout 1900 and 1901, Picasso produced works depicting Montmartre life, including the Moulin de la Galette at the top of the hill. In 1900, the northern side of the hill, seen here, was composed of vineyards and a shanty town known as the Maquis, or scrubland, inhabited by refugees from Baron Haussmann's rebuilding project in the centre of Paris. Picasso returned to Barcelona that Christmas, and after suicide by shooting of Picasso's friend in the Hippodrome Café, Carles Casagemas, Picasso began his blue period, living in Nonel's studio and painting the downtrodden inhabitants of the area, including female inmates in the Saint-Lazare prison. The period culminated in the overpainting of Last Moments as a rejection of its religious version of hope, covering it instead with his masterwork, La Vie. However, from 1904, Picasso moved into a studio for artists in a converted piano factory, which would become known as the Bateau Lavoir. In this period, Picasso met his muse Fernande and began his more optimistic Rose period, painting the circus workers of the Cirque Métrannon, who parted in Hôtel des Deux Hémisphères nearby. During his time in the Bateau Lavoir, Picasso consumed opium at weekly gatherings, owning his own amber-coloured bamboo opium pipe. In the second half of the decade, the attentions of the Paris dealers, such as the Steins, polarized around the two figures of Matisse and Picasso, and a certain rivalry ensued, at least on the part of the clique surrounding Picasso. This tension impelled both men forwards. On the one hand, Matisse's need to move beyond Fauvism resulted in Matisse's The Joy of Life in 1906. On the other, an interest in African masks and the narcotic and radical atmosphere of the Bateau Lavoir would produce Picasso's proto-cubist work, The Demoiselles d'Avignon, in 1907. Flamenc had first discovered the interest in African masks, and it was Matisse who gave Picasso his first encounter with African art during their meeting at the Steins, with Picasso visiting the Musée d'Ethnographie in Paris soon after. The discoveries inherent in these two works would come to their fruition at the end of the decade. Matisse's liberation from naturalistic colouring and now from naturalistically described space enabled him to create the dance and music, while Picasso, working in parallel with Georges Braque, made a series of excursions to Horta and Cadaqués, both in northeastern Spain, which resulted in the development of Cubism. In this first decade, artists flocked from all over Europe to Paris, definitively not the capital of the avant-garde. Brancusi had travelled allegedly on foot from Romania to Paris in 1903, Duchamp arrived from Rouen in 1904, Kandinsky stayed from 1906 to 1907, Modigliani arrived from Italy in 1906, Diego Rivera in 1909, Chagall in 1910, Mondrian and De Kiriko in 1911, and all were transformed by their stay. When Amadeo Modigliani arrived in Paris, he announced himself as wanting to be a sculptor, despite his proven ability to paint and draw portraits. He was described as being quiet and reserved, but within a year of arriving in Montmartre and sleeping on the floors of the Bateau Lavoir, he had become a heavy drinker and drug user, famously dancing naked and high on cocaine with the Spanish woman known only as La Chica on the street outside his shack at 7 Place Jean-Baptiste Clemont. It's been argued that Modigliani's drug use was a desperate attempt to disguise the symptoms of the tuberculosis he had contracted as a teenager. As the major cause of death in turn of the century France, sufferers became pariah groups. Finally, Modigliani was introduced to Brancusi in 1909, and he studied under him for 3 years before returning to portrait painting with a new formal vocabulary, representing the inner life of the sitter using hands, face, and body posture, and using eyes symbolically, crystal blue for innocence, one dark eye to represent inner vision, creating some of the most beautiful and haunting images of the human form in artistic history, before his death from tuberculosis in 1920. Modigliani had followed the artistic exodus in the second decade of the century from Montmartre to Montparnasse, replacing Montmartre's famous bars such as Azan's outside the Bateau Lavoir or the Lapin Agile on the north side of the hill. It was the cafes along the Boulevard Montparnasse, such as the Dôme and the Rotonde, which became the new meeting places of avant-garde artists. Nightclubs, such as the Closerie des Lilas and the Bal Boulier, perennial sources of illegal drugs, now became regular centres of artistic life. La Ruche, or the Beehive, to the southwest of Montparnasse, housed various artists, including Modigliani, Diego Rivera, and Chagall. The move from Montmartre had been occasioned by the suicide of one of the artists in the Bateau Lavoir and the clearance of the Maquis, and hence artists had looked elsewhere for cheap lodgings and studios. Picasso, with his newfound success, had moved out of the Bateau Lavoir at the end of the first decade to live on the Boulevard de Clichy, but soon after had moved to the Boulevard de Raspail in Montparnasse. Marc Chagall was born in Liozno, near Vitebsk, in modern-day Belarusia, then inside the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire, the Western Zone, outside which no Jewish people could settle. In My Life, an autobiography of his early life, including his stay in Paris before the First World War, he describes narrowly escaping death in a pogrom. On a visit home to Vitebsk, while studying art in St. Petersburg, Chagall met his future wife, Bella Rosenfeld. After his arrival in Paris, Chagall produced works influenced by Cubism, such as this one, Homage to Apollinaire, based on the reconciliation after the fall from the Garden of Eden. Chagall recalls with pride in La Vie how the poet and critic Apollinaire, on visiting Chagall in his studio, looked at his works and exclaimed with wonder, "Supernatural." Chagall went on to develop his own symbolic style to represent both his life in Paris and his memories of Vitebsk as well, and this latter fact, along with Chagall's Hasidic upbringing, give insights into his work, speaking of the importance of a communion with the infinite through nature and self-awareness, relating art to this, talking of it as a continuation of nature, of God's creation. Finally, Chagall left Paris in 1914 and returned to Vitebsk to marry Bella Rosenfeld. Then the First World War broke out and Paris became a ghost town. However, in neighbouring Switzerland, an art movement began which was to profoundly influence art in Paris. German artists, émigrés from the war, came to Zurich, first meeting in cafes such as the Terrasse or the Odeon, before Hugo Ball set up the Cabaret Voltaire, and with the arrival of the Romanian Tristan Tzara, Dada was born. Its aim, to protest the barbaric insanity of the war, and to do so through performances which emphasized destruction and meaninglessness. Hans Richter recounts the angry reaction to the last Dada performance in Zurich. A madness had transformed individual human beings into a mob. The performance was stopped, the lights went up, and faces distorted by rage gradually returned to normal. People were realizing that not only Cerna's provocations, but also the rage of those provoked had something inhuman, and that this had been the reason for Cerna's performance in the first place. Through Cerna's contribution, the public had gained in self-awareness. The third part of the program, in no less aggressive than the second part, reached its end without incident. From 1906 to 1912, Marcel Duchamp lived on the Rue Calancourt, seen earlier in the photo of the Maquis in Montmartre. Rue Calancourt is to the left of the picture. In 1912 he moved to Rue Saint-Hippolyte in Montparnasse, having created Bride in Munich as a gift for Francis Picabia. Duchamp was very much in love with Picabia's wife, Gabriele Buffet-Picabia, and imagery in the work would be used later in Duchamp's magnum opus, the bride stripped bare by her bachelors even, known as the large glass. While in Montparnasse, Duchamp had attached a bicycle wheel to a stool, simply as an object that he liked to spin and watch in his studio. But the idea of using found objects as art led to Bottle Rack of 1914, but which Duchamp had left in his Montparnasse studio and was destroyed. Also in Montparnasse, and in common with the later Zurich Dada artists, Duchamp was interested in the aleatory, creating stoppage by recording in wood the random shapes of 3 1-meter wires dropped from a height of 1 meter onto the floor. Duchamp left Paris for New York in 1915, and on the basis of the succès de scandale of his Cubist and Futurist-inspired Nude Descending a Staircase No. 2 at the Armory Show of 1913, was given an apartment by the Arensbergs just west of Central Park. Duchamp is considered to be one of the founder members of New York Dada, but Duchamp's work is more playful and analytical than Zurich Dada. In New York, Duchamp set up, with Walter Arensberg, the Society of Independent Artists, and encouraged the board to accept works for a fee without a jury. Arensberg and Duchamp then bought a urinal and submitted it as Fountain under the name of Richard Mutt. The Fountain was rejected, and thus, helped by an editorial in The Blind Man, written by Duchamp, with the idea of the ready-made, he achieved another succès de scandale. After the war and a brief stay in Buenos Aires, Duchamp returned to Paris and in 1923 completed The Large Glass. By this time, Duchamp had renounced his position as a public artist, and The Large Glass was as complex and deeply personal a project as Fountain was a radical challenge to the art world and the public. Duchamp's 1912 gift of Francis Picabia Bride forms the focus of the upper half of the work. While staying in Munich earlier that year, Duchamp had asked Picabia's wife Gabrielle to meet him at the railway station of Andelot in the Jura, near where she had been visiting her mother. Gabrielle's account of the meeting gives us insight into Duchamp's mind. "We remained in the station on a wooden bench. We spent the night, and I left before him. Even now I find it really astonishing and very moving, very young too. It was a kind of madness, idiocy, to travel all the way from Munich to Jura to pass a few hours of the night with me. It was utterly inhumane to sit next to a being whom you sense desires you so much, and not even to have been touched. Above all, I thought, I must be very careful with everything I say to him, because he understands things in quite an alarming way, in an absolute way." Just as Duchamp's ready-mades are a conceptual leap in the nature of art, the large glass, intended to be accompanied by a theoretical text called The Green Box, rejected what Duchamp called the purely retinal, embracing instead a cerebral approach to art. The completion of the work was the result of chance. When the glass of the work shattered during transport, Duchamp declared the work finished. Other Dadaists arriving in Paris just after the war were Tristan Tzara, arriving from Zurich, and the photographer Man Ray, who had worked with Duchamp on the large glass in New York. Whilst at an exhibition, Man Ray had met Eric Satie, who helped him to buy the flat iron, brass tacks and glue used to make cadeaux. Man Ray additionally produced this Dadaist object, based on a line from the text of Les Chants de Malraux by the Comte de Lautréamont, the nom de plume of the Uruguayan-born French poet Isidore Ducasse, a writer admired by Modigliani and the Surrealists. Although in many ways Dadaism and Surrealism seem to have elements in common, as Patrick Waldberg points out here, Dada's aims were to protest against the false rationalism of the society responsible for the First World War, or for a stifling conservatism in the arts. Surrealism ultimately was intrinsically creative, and its aim was ultimately greater self-knowledge. Giorgio De Kiriko was born in Greece to parents of Italian extraction, and after the death of his father, De Kiriko moved with his family to Munich, where he was deeply affected by reading the works of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. In 1909, in the Piazza Santa Croce in Florence, De Kiriko underwent an experience in which he was unable to recognize the square in which he was, despite having been there many times before. This experience, as well as elements of Nietzsche's philosophical system, informed the art which De Kiriko produced in Paris between 1911 and 1914, featuring a low-level distance with nothing rising above it, unsettling colouring, and perspectival buildings with repeated verticals to emphasize the infinite vanishing point and yet emphasize its unreachability. These are arguably visual parallels to elements in Nietzsche's philosophy, the rejection of higher ideals which purport to be infinite but are in fact merely illusory. Most surrealists were indebted to De Kiriko's visual vocabulary, but the movement itself had its conceptual roots in a different system, that of psychoanalysis, the therapeutic system dealing with the unconscious mind as developed by Sigmund Freud around the turn of the 20th century. André Breton had specialized in mental illness at medical school before the First World War, and had encountered Freud's theories while treating shell shock victims during the war in the Saint-Dizier neuropsychiatric hospital. After the war in 1919, he founded the surrealist publication Littérature, producing the first manifesto of surrealism 5 years later. In 1921, Breton traveled to Vienna to meet Sigmund Freud in his clinic, but discovered that Freud's focus was exclusively on psychoanalysis as having a therapeutic rather than an artistic function. Breton's expression was primarily literary, developing automatic writing with Philippe Soupault, composing jointly in a trance-like state to bypass the repression of the conscious mind. Joao Miro, the Catalan artist, having visited Paris in 1919, moved there in 1920. Despite having studied art, having graduated in 1910, his father made him work in an office, and Miro suffered a breakdown, being sent to the family farm in Montreuil to recover. There he made a deep connection to his roots, and imagery from Montreuil began to surface in his post-war paintings. In Paris, coming into contact with Surrealism through André Masson, the symbolism of the paintings began to take precedence over depictions of waking reality. In May 1921, Cologne-based surrealist Max Ernst had organized an exhibition which had caused a riot and had been closed by the authorities, and so his visa for an exhibition in Paris arranged by Breton was refused. However, Ernst resettled in Paris the following year. As he described his city collages, they express the chance meeting of two realities on an unfamiliar plane, the culture of systematic displacement and its effects. His techniques of frottage and grattage, whilst referencing the solitary sexual act, also act to reveal, through scraping, the hidden material beneath the surface.